The most important sound in hard techno track is the kick. Distorting it can take a lot of time and skill. You could see how complex it was in my SLVL and USH kick tutorial where I used only Ableton effects. But a simpler and more beginner friendly approach is to use a versatile distortion plugin. I will use today the old and reliable iZotope Trash 2 to make this kick. On top of using Trash 2, I will also show you a few more of my Ableton tricks. This kick and the whole beat you have heard is from my newest hard techno template you can download from my website. It's a full track project with all sound design, arrangement and mixing already done, so you can learn step by step how to produce hard techno. And for more distorted kicks, check out my sample packs. The main reason why your industrial kicks don't hit hard in the beginning is because they don't have enough low-end punch. Sample selection is key. When you choose your kicks for punch, focus on how much low-end power they have. If you are not sure on whether you pick good kicks, use a low-pass filter on the master channel and then pick the samples. For example, I will be using this sample that, after low passing, still maintains punch. Another kick seems okay as well, but with a low-pass filter, it turns out it has less punch. The first kick gets distorted. It's important to not distort it too much, otherwise you will lose the low end and the kick will sound weak. My favorite Ableton trick is to use Redux for a nice fuzz. I turn down the bit depth, which brings up the noise. And to make the fuzz longer, I turn on the DC shift. Optionally, I fine-tune the details with remaining knobs. I feel like the kick needs more warmth. For that, my go-to effect is the drum bass. I add lots of distortion and decide what distortion style sounds best. While the drive fattens the kick, the crunch adds more mids. I will use it as well. I turn up the damp so the drum bass doesn't cut the high end, and I fine-tune the kick with transients knob. After using drum bass, I add noise again. For that, I will use erosion in the noise mode. This bandpass filter controls what frequencies of the noise get added. And the amount tells how loud the noise is. At last, to give the kick more warmth, I add a characteristic dynamic tube effect that will make the kick sound a bit like a fart. Again, I start with adding lots of distortions through both drive and bias. Then I fine-tune the effect with choosing a different tube model and the tone knob. I finished distorting the kick. Notice we still have fat low end. Now I can low pass the kick to make it sound deeper and shorten it with shaper and utility. This works in the same way as the LFO tool or Kickstart 2 plugin with a certain preset. We will add two more kick sounds to support the punch we already have, but before that, let me just say that if you would like to learn music production even faster with an individual approach, visit my website to learn more about my private music production lessons. I offer bulk pricing and you can schedule a free consultation call to discuss with me what you should learn to progress fast. The second kick I add will add more mid frequencies. Why am I adding another kick sound for mids instead of just not using the low pass filter on the first kick? On the second kick, I will use a different distortion technique that will make the kick sound like in many industrial techno tracks. The kick I use here also has plenty of low ends and some mids, and that's enough. What matters is the right distortion technique. I use on that kick iZotope Trash 2. Use the input fader to make the kick volume reach the yellow area of the meter. And add enough distortion so you can hear the change in the kick. Turn on the first filter and add a large peak anywhere in the frequency range from 100 to 400 Hz. For that, I prefer high-pass filters with large resonance. I don't need this kick to have lots of high end. We focus on the mids after all, so I add a low pass filter too. Optionally, experiment with extra filters that boost or cut remaining frequencies. Now return to the trash module and pick either of these distortion styles I personally use most often and fine-tune them with pre, drive and style if available. I can also use these faders and the drawing area to add extra points that further change the wave shaper settings. I will use these features to add much more distortion, because while I already have that nice characteristic sound, there is way too little fuzz. I lowered the output even more, so the kick is as loud as before distortion. And I turn off the limiter. I simply don't need it here. I equalize the sample. To prevent any phase issues that I talk about in this video that covers most common problems with rumbles, I use a high-pass filter and I boost the mids and highs. The set kick sound will add a high frequencies burst. I will use for that the kick we already have. Duplicate the channel and use the bounce track and place option. To export the kick, drag it to the drum rack and tweak the sample in Simpler. The kick has to fill the high end, so I experiment with pitching up the sample. When that happens, I often add some warping. The Beats mode creates cool glitching effects you control with the Preserve mode and Envelope. I also trim the sample. I high-pass the kick. And now I feel like the kick needs more noise in the high end. The erosion effect we used before will become useful again. After tweaking the kick volume, the punch part of the kick is finished. It's time to make the rumble. I will use once again the kick we exported, that I dragged onto yet another pad in the drum rack. Instead of using reverb, I will play this kick throughout the second half of the beat. To get rid of that transient from the rumble, I will reverse the kick sample and play it from a different moment. The sample can be pitched up or down. That helps with making the kick either more deep or rumbly. To hear better what does this rumble sound like with the kick, I use a low-pass filter. For a more chaotic sound, I increase the stereo width. And here's a disclaimer, the width knob won't change anything if the sample is already a mono sound. The rumble must have some stereo width. To fine-tune the moment when the rumble gets audible, I use Shaper and Utility for quote-unquote sidechain compression. In the end, I can return to the Simpler and change the sample starting point, tweak the transpose again, or sequence the notes in the MIDI clip differently. Each of these things will change the rhythm and feel of the low-end rumble. I bounce the whole kick again, and I drag it into the drum rack. Out of that sample, using the same approach you've seen a minute ago, I create a rumble layer. This time to fill mid frequencies. Notice that I am experimenting with warping and pitching down the sample extremely to give the rumble an interesting texture. I give these mid frequencies a different rhythm and I filter the sound. Similarly as before, I add quote-unquote sidechain to control the rhythm and Utility for stereo widths. This time this rumble stays narrow. The rumble is not as crispy as the kick in the beginning, and the whole kick doesn't seem glued as well. We can add to the group processing some distortion. I want to use a lot of it, and iZotope Trash 2 will be perfect for that. Try to do as much as you can with the trash module. To make the distortion even more crispy, I messed around with the wave shaper curve and I added a few points for extra fuzz. If you want to experiment more, use the filter one again. Large resonances, as before, change the kick a lot. Use high pass and peak filters, but definitely don't remove any low end because it will take out all the energy from the kick. After distortion, if there is a need to, for example, shape the high end of the kick or to control the rumble in the mids, I can use a multiband compressor. In case of this kick, it adds more click by compressing the high end and the mids are slightly glued. I will already say that I find I need to use a multiband compressor on every 4th or 5th kick I make, so this is not a mandatory effect as it often brings a little difference to the sound. However, if you want to learn using multiband compressor to be in full control over the sound, watch this tutorial that will guide you step by step on how to glue the kick and bass sounds with it. Another way to add more click to the kick is to use either a transient shaper or an automated equalizer. I am explaining both techniques in this sound design / mixing tutorial, but you could also see automated EQ in the SLVL and USH kick tutorial. The goal is to help the kick to cut through all the instruments. In the end, I EQ'd the whole kick in a similar way as in this tutorial I made a few months ago. After using lots of distortion, there is a need to make cuts from around 200 to 300 Hz to cut the mud from the sound. Kicks also need a big low-end boost to sound deep, and for that I use a low-shelf filter. The high-pass filter here cleans up the frequencies you won't hear anyways, but it also adds on purpose some phase shifting that further change the way the low-end sounds like. This time this made the kick better. The remaining filters, including the extra one in the second EQ, shape the mids and boost highs for a brighter kick. At the very end, a mid-side EQ makes the kick a bit more mono in the low end. And for loudness, I use Ableton's limiter in a soft clip mode and short release to not lose much of a transient. On the oscilloscope, you can see how the limiter shaves peaks. Later, during mastering, the final limiter will reduce the dynamic range even more. But if you'd like to see how to make an industrial techno kick drum that is much more flat, yet it still sounds good and full, watch this Wiese Asbach kick tutorial that also uses a reverb rumble technique I didn't use today for a different rhythm and style of kick.